All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and I've been going over the PowerPoint presentations for JavaScript 6th edition, the Web Warrior series by Vodnik and Gosselin. We're up to Chapter 10 of 12, and here we're going to talk about the role of JavaScript in mobile or mobile development. Notice again we have a very small number of objectives. We want to be able to integrate mouse, touch, and pointer events into a web app, obtain and work with a user's geolocation information, and optimize a mobile web app to accommodate the common constraints experienced by mobile users. Before we even start, let's address these one at a time. If a person's working with a mobile device, it could be a tablet, it could be a phone, but there's at least a chance, even on a tablet, they don't have access to a mouse. You won't have one on a phone, of course, and you most often don't have one on a tablet. You also may not even have a keyboard. Okay, so it's more touch oriented. All right, the geolocation, maybe you've done this where for example, let's say that I'm in a town that I'm on vacation in. All right, and I'm walking around in the town, and it's a big town, whatever. Let's say that I'm in San Francisco, and I'm in a certain spot in San Francisco, and I want to go to a movie. There's a new movie out that I want to see. So I go in my phone and I type in local movie theaters. All right, and I hit enter. Well, a lot of times I'm going to get a message then, something about somebody wants to keep track of your location, deny or allow. That's the user's geolocation information. All right, and then finally, what are some of the problems experienced by mobile users, especially, let's think about the phone here. Even with a bigger phone, there's an issue with screen size. All right, there's an issue with limited battery life. You might only be able to have a certain number of things open at a time, etc. So that's all things we're going to discuss. I'm looking at this, and these are the authors' things, not mine. So they said most. So I'm just changing that. So when you have a touchscreen event that doesn't have a mouse, as it says, browsers fire click events when the user touches the screen. But other events don't translate as well for touchscreens. These are the things that we think about with mouse events. But again, with most mobile devices, a mouse doesn't come into play. So as it says here, on a touchscreen device, some web page elements respond to mouse events. All right. Divs are not considered clickable, doesn't fire mouse events on a touchscreen. Links and form elements are clickable. All right. Touch cascade. The browser checks a touched element for an event and sees whether or not it can handle it and how it can handle it. So notice that rather than mouse down, mouse up, click, mouse move, mouse over, and mouse out, you now have things like touch start, touch end. Still have mouse over, but it's not your mouse. It's typically your hand when you're moving mouse over, mouse move, and mouse down and mouse up, and the click event. So notice as it says here, touchscreen devices fire touchscreen specific events for some elements. This was started by Apple, and it's been expanded upon by Microsoft. They do it in virtually the same way. So if you look here with touch events, these are things that respond to users' finger touches on a touchscreen. So if you were to take your mouse and swipe across your screen and then let go, you'd have a touch start, you'd have a touch move, you'd have a touch end. You could also possibly have a touch cancel. So, good chart here. Touch start is like a mouse down. The touch move is like a mouse move. The touch end is like a mouse up. And the touch cancel is like it's unique to the touch screen. Because with a mouse, it's not like you can exactly cancel an event. Now, when you work with touch coordinates, it says mouse events can work with event properties. Okay? But there are things that it may or may not understand, such as typically, if you are touching the screen at one time and you touch it again, nothing will happen. Because as it says, typically, you can't have multiple touches on a screen at once. All right? They don't support client X and client Y, which makes it harder if I'm doing a program on a mobile device and it's a game where I have to move around. It's easier on a non-mobile device to work with client X and client Y to have your X and Y coordinates. Each touch event, as it says, has its own array properties. Here they are. All right. Distinguishing between app and device interaction. So am I doing it, or is it something natural that the system is doing? Touchscreen devices use touch events for more than one purpose. I talked about that prevent default method earlier. So what you can do is you can ensure that the system doesn't respond in a natural way, that you can cancel that from happening. So again, the example I gave, because it's one that's used a lot with this, is maybe I've got a hyperlink, but I don't want you to be able, when you click it, to go to that site for whatever reason. Maybe it's down, maybe I shouldn't have access to it, whatever. So I can use the prevent default on there to keep the natural action of me clicking on a hyperlink from happening. All right, implementing touch events. You've seen stuff like this before. You're used to using the mouse, but with a mobile device, you're using your finger. Touchscreens are used basically on tablets, on notebook computers. Touchscreens are used on phones. As it says, it makes coding for touch and mouse events more complicated. Some devices support a stylus. I know that I've got a Samsung Galaxy 5 and I've got a stylus that I don't use often, but I've got it. It's a little pen that's available if I want to use it. Some devices have trackpads. All right, let's not talk about Microsoft stuff unique to them. You can look at it. I'll leave it up here for a minute, but it's really, in the mainstream of things, is not that important. All right. Microsoft pointer events, and I guess here they are. All right. Identifying pointer screen coordinates. Client X and client Y properties are like mouse events. As it says, stopping OS gestures. Okay, setting values to none. This still looks Microsoft-ish to me. All right. So let's jump ahead. Using programming interfaces for mobile devices. I already mentioned geolocation to you to provide your coordinates, your latitude and longitude of where you currently are. Battery status reports the charge level of a device battery. You might do things like, for example, I believe if you take your phone and you put it in airplane mode, it's supposed to keep the power longer, that kind of thing. Device orientation. You can set up an app, for example, if it's a game and you want to make the game available for people to play on their phones, you might want to set it up to landscape only, so they have to turn their phone sideways. And WebRTC, which as it says, and I don't remember what the RTC stands for, but it provides access to the internal camera, microphones, etc. on your machine. So we talked a little about geolocation. Access through the geolocation property of the navigation object. You can get the current position as it says there. You can do a watch position. So you can say, this is where I am. Think about why you might want to do that. There are apps that you can buy, etc. that I go to a concert and I park, and I have to park quite a ways away. There are apps that you can get that you can basically send a signal when you're there, and it'll record where you're parked, so when you leave again, you can figure out where you did park. All right? Callbacks. Callbacks are interesting. They're basically typically a function call within a function. Get current position, as it says, requests your current position one time. These are the properties. I'm not going to run through any of those. By no means am I an expert on this stuff. Here is an example of how they could be used. A more enhanced example. As it says, if you're using older browsers, you need to basically tell the person that they should update. You need to clear geolocation history for testing. So to clear that, it's shown right here. I'm not going to run through that with you. Sometimes users don't notice or ignore a geolocation request. Then, as it says, the request neither succeeds nor does it fail, but any dependent code is not executed. So if I say, give me a listing of movies, and it does, or I'm like, maybe I'll eat first, and I put my phone back in my pocket, I might have had a request that I don't answer. So they give you a little thing here, this flow chart, showing the flow of current geolocation code. If the browser doesn't support it, boom, you're kind of dead in the water right to begin with. If it does, you ask for the current position. Okay? And if you give it, yeah, it'll show you. And if it doesn't, it'll typically fail. You typically will set a timeout on this because you don't want to give the user hours and hours before they answer. If the timeout expires, you trigger a failure. If the user responds, you cancel the timeout. And again, this is typically how that would be done. This is a little bit more in-depth on the geolocation stuff. All right, I'm not going to run through any of that. All right, let's just jump over here. And I already talked about battery. Another thing that you have to worry about more, and it's not that it's not an issue with desktops or laptops, it is. We've had very bad weather here in the area in the last few days, and it used to be when you'd get bad weather and you'd get a lightning strike, you know, the power would go off and boom, you lost everything and you'd be all upset. But now typically what happens is that the battery kicks in. But again, the battery will only kick in for as long as that battery has power. So if you don't constantly charge your machine, you know, you could be out of luck. Now, that's why typically you will charge your phone every night or every other night or however, depending on how much the battery life goes down. I have been told that in a way charging a battery is kind of like what you do with the gas in your car. It's recommended that every once in a while you let your gas run down way to the bottom so that any crud that's in the bottom of your tank, okay, will be flushed out. In much the same way that it's good every once in a while to let your battery run down and then start with fresh juice, so to speak. So here are the properties, and here are the associated methods. Device orientation, I already talked about with you. Okay. We're talking about access to position, horizontal, vertical, you know, how does it move, speed, etc. You've got both a gyroscope and an accelerometer. An accelerometer is an interesting one because if you've ever done any work with apps, for instance, if I were to download a Magic 8-Ball app onto my phone and I want it to be realistic, I'd have to ask a question, and then rather than clicking a button or tapping the screen, I'd have to shake the screen. And that's where the accelerometer comes into play. Well, there's what RTC is. It's real-time communication. As it says, it enables apps to receive data from devices such as cameras and phones, their camera and their phone, and send and receive in real time, which means while it's happening. Should eventually allow text and video chat using only HTML and JavaScript. All right, there are all sorts of testing tools that you can use. Says it's often impractical. You're not going to be able to sit there and grab 8 different types of cell phones. So what you can typically do is inside of your laptop or inside of your desktop, you can run emulators for testing. They're not quite the original, but they're pretty close. Some of the problems you have, we already mentioned these. Typically, mobile speeds are slower even in hotspots. All right, most users have data caps if you've ever gone through that with yours. You know, you'll hear about places like Sprint and Verizon now does it, and a lot of them that offer unlimited data. It is unlimited, but if you're using 4G, fourth generation data, you're at a certain speed, but usually when you reach your limit, so if your limit is 20 meg a month and you reach that, it'll still do it, but you won't be 4G anymore. You'll typically be a lot slower as far as your speed. Minimizing downsize, loading scripts responsively. Well, you don't load everything if you don't need it, for example. You only load it on an as-needed basis, and when you're done with it, you close it. We've talked a little bit about minifying files. You'll see that later. I'll show you the difference between the minified version of jQuery and the non-minified version. With the minified, all the unnecessary white space has been removed, along with comments. You can tweak code in other ways. All right, there are online minifying services available. So after you write your CSS, you can minify your CSS file or files. So again, this chapter was meant to just be an introduction to JavaScript and its role in mobile or mobile development. That's it for Chapter 10. I will save that. When I come back again, I will go into Chapter 11, which I believe is on Ajax. And yes, it is. All right, so we'll be back with some talk about Ajax in just a couple.